There is a story, but to prepare our minds, there's several Zenisms, one might call them. And the first is that story about the very rich merchant who fell in love with a storekeeper's wife. So they plotted between them to bring about the demise of the husband so that they could run off together. And this is what they did. But the rich merchant soon found that the woman was a manipulating and greedy shrew. So he left her. But soon after, he was overcome with a great sense of remorse. So he began wandering from place to place, seeking a means of atonement to expiate his wrongdoing. And before long, he came to a village nestled at the bottom of a large and precipitous mountain, where the villagers had to traverse a path where many of them lost their lives to ply their trade in the nearby city. This was the merchant's chance. He decided that he was going to dig a tunnel to allow the villagers to have safe passage through to do their business, ply their trade. So he began to dig, and he dug and dug. But in the meanwhile, the son of the assassinated man grew up and sought revenge for his father's death. So he went seeking for the rich merchant, and he eventually found him. The son took his sword and placed it at the throat of the merchant. And the rich merchant said, "I'm ready to die by your sword, but please, will you wait until I complete my task?" So the young man agreed. So day after day he sat and watched the rich merchant as he dug his tunnel. But soon he became so bored that he decided that he too would take up the task. So taking a shovel, he worked alongside the rich merchant, and they dug, and they dug, and finally their task was complete. The tunnel, the safe passage for the villagers, was made. The rich merchant turned to the young man, now not so young, and he said, now is the time to wield your sword." The young man fell on his knees in front of the now old merchant, with tears flowing from his eyes. He said, "How can I kill you, my teacher and master?" And then there's that pithy little Zen anecdote about the acolyte who came to the Zen master and said, "Master, I have so many thoughts in my mind. I meditate and meditate and meditate, and still my mind is full of thoughts. What can I do? The Zen master said, throw them out. Eject them, throw them out. But he was a rather cheeky acolyte, and he said, well, what about if I have nothing in my mind? The Zen master looked at him and said, well, then carry it out. So this little pithy anecdote poses a dilemma for us. But if we wax philosophical about it, we can realize that it's telling us that every thought that we have becomes something. So if we have nothing in our mind, then it's immediately something. So we have a dilemma. And perhaps this story will throw some light on this. And it's the story of another rich merchant who happened to be a very pious and traditional Jew, living in the city of Medvedj. Now, the city of Medvedj housed the one who was called the Great Megid, the founder of Hasidic Judaism, that celebratory lineage. The Great Megid was famous. But back to our merchant. He was a traditionalist. Every day he went to the house of learning to study the great books. And he was very fortunate because his wife assisted him. So he only had to spend 2 hours a day in his shop because his wife took care of it for the remainder of the time, leaving him free to pursue his spiritual studies. But one day he went to the synagogue, and there at the synagogue there were 3 young men who he immediately recognized as being travelers from a far-off place. So he went over to them and gave them the usual salutary greeting, and then he asked them where they were from and what they were doing there. And they responded that they had traveled from a very great distance to visit the Great Megid. And so the merchant thought to himself, I've never been to see this Great Megid. Perhaps I should take time, since these young men have come so far away to see him, and I've never even been in his presence. Perhaps I should maybe I can take an hour off from my 2 hours at the shop, just to, not to interrupt his time of study, of course. So this he did. And as soon as he came into the presence of this great rabbi, he was overwhelmed by the illumination, the shining countenance of this being. So he began to visit regularly, not interrupting his time at the house of learning, of course. And soon he became a great follower, loving the Great Megid. But during this time, his business fell away. In fact, he almost became penurious. No customers at all. And he pondered on this. How could this be? How could it be when he goes in the presence of this great being, he becomes so dedicated to this great soul that such could happen to him? So he went to the Great Megid and asked him. And the Great Megid said, "It is said in the great book that if a man wishes to become wise, he travels south. If he wants to become wealthy, he goes north. And we know there is a great divide between north and south. But what if a man wants to become wealthy and wise? The rich merchant, now not rich, bowed his head, waiting for a response, because he had no answer. And the great Megid said, one must become as nothing. And when we become nothing, we become spirit. And when we're spirit, spirit has no form, no quantity, no boundaries, and therefore there is no divide between north and south. The merchant took on that which was being transmitted to him, and he began to become humble. He dropped his piety. He dropped his spiritual cloak, and soon he was richer than he had ever been before. In this dilemma, where we can think nothing, we can even say, I am nothing. But immediately we do so, we render ourselves as something. So what then is this nothing? What then is it that we become? And how do we become it? Knowing that this indeed must occur for us, but not by means of our mind seeking it as a goal, as a destination. What then is meant by this story? What is it that the Megid means? Become as nothing, and you become spirit. Spirit has no form. What is it that you've proven through your life? We can be told, we can read the books, we can think, we understand the words, or even think that we glean an understanding of their meaning. But what makes it irrefutable, absolute for us? Can only be the experience. Only the experience makes it so. What then is this nothing? What's your experience? We have it. We know it. What's the experience of it? When have you been nothing? Remember, when have you been placed in the situation where you've been rendered nothing?
At the time of experience, there's no time.
You're right.
Paradoxical.
That's right. Absolutely so. When we lose our sense of self, we lose our sense of something, isn't it? So simple. So simple. And we can remember, but how can we live it? How can we live those moments? Maybe a moment of trauma, where we've had a gun at our head, or something of this nature. Or even losing ourselves in some transcendental experience. But we know what was absent in those instances, any sense of self. Isn't it so? Any sense of self was absent. Could it be that this is what's meant? Could it be that this is that state of nothingness? Simple as that? Can we live in that, what appears to be that heightened state, where through some dramatic moment all comes together and we're not there? Like when the car runs over our child, or there's someone in a burning house. No thought. Can we live in that state? Yes, we can. We can live in that state of intensity. Do you dare? Do you dare?